So what I shall try to do is offer a synthetic view of what we have learned about changes in inequality and the factors that have been driving that change in order to assess the direction of current trajectories. As you all know just too well, Latin America has the distinction of still being the area of the world with the greatest inequality. Still, starting in the 1990s and accelerating in the 2000s, we have seen almost everywhere, to a greater or lesser degree, a decline in the Gini. What we see here is this general trajectory downward, with the exception of Costa Rica, which started from a very low level but has been gradually trending up. We see very steep declines in Bolivia and Ecuador. The declines in Uruguay and Argentina are impressive because they end up at such a low level. And we see the downward trajectory in Brazil, but very importantly, the uptick after 2014. Okay, so let me explain my case selection for this presentation. I'm concentrating on the countries that made the most progress because I'm interested in how and why they were able to do that and what the chances are that this progress will be preserved. In our 2012 book, John and I evaluated the theoretical arguments with data from the universe of Latin American cases. But for today, we on the one hand have the most likely cases, in other words, the economically most advanced countries that were also the welfare state pioneers, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay. And on the other hand, we have the less likely cases, Bolivia, Ecuador, El Salvador, and in some, depending on the data availability, we will see Nicaragua as well. We have that less likely cases where great efforts have been made. And finally, I have Mexico there because you can see that, yeah, there is a downward trend, but it's very moderate. And Mexico is often used as a case to argue that the left didn't make a difference. Okay. All right. Along with the decline in inequality also came a decline in poverty. And here we see several interesting trends, clear reductions in the most likely cases, very steep ones in Bolivia and Ecuador, and in contrast, a slight dip and then a re-increase, essentially stability in Mexico. And again, we see the reversal of the trend in Brazil after 2014. Now, political inclusion, of course, had expanded as well. Never had so many Latin American countries had democracies that lasted this long. The electorate had expanded, and in several countries had started to include the lower socioeconomic sectors and ethnic minorities. So as of roughly 5 years ago, it seemed there was at least a chance that the second crisis of incorporation, as Filguera, Regadas, Luna, and Alegre called it, was finding a solution. Okay. More recently, political conditions have taken a turn for the worse. Most obvious has been the case of Brazil, with the impeachment of Dilma and the election of Bolsonaro, an apologist for the military government that ruled Brazil for over 20 years. Venezuela has become a human and political disaster. Ortega in Nicaragua has dropped any pretense of being anything other than a power-hungry politician willing to resort to repression. Morales is seeking ways to perpetuate his rule. The extent to which Correa mortgaged the economic future of Ecuador is becoming visible. And the Nueva Mayoría in Chile has become unglued. Okay. Also, of course, economic growth has slowed, and clearly the recession in Brazil has had a lot to do with Dilma's impeachment. It has had an effect on Uruguay because of the close trading relationship. So the big question really is, whether previous gains in lowering inequality and poverty are being reversed, whether Brazil is a trendsetter, and whether the crisis of incorporation remains a crisis that yet has to find a solution and may lead us either down the path of symbolic populist incorporation or re-exclusion by force, as in the 60s and 70s. So let me then take a systematic look at the constellation of factors that is needed for sustained progress towards lessening of inequalities and trace their patterns of change over the last 2 decades. So what has been behind this progress? So let me first state my theoretical position very briefly and very generally. Okay. And then elaborate a bit on the mechanisms before considering alternative views. So first, what has been at the root of progress is democracy, or political systems that allow for organizing and for political competition for votes. Second, a political party or parties that have a commitment to reducing inequality, or what we generally call a party of the left. A party of the left strong enough to win executive office or at least make a credible bid and get representation in the legislature. Third, a state apparatus capable of guaranteeing order, extracting resources, and implementing policies. And fourth, a supportive or at least permissive international economic and geopolitical context. So, let me now be a little more specific about the mechanisms that link democracy and left strength to inequality before coming to the importance and the trajectory of each of these drivers in turn. First, this is a conceptual model, okay, with the essential mechanisms that can be affected by policies. We could complicate it even more with additional demographic and economic variables, and I could talk about this later, but right now I want to concentrate on the politics and the policy. Okay, and let me work backward, okay, from the most proximate causes to the more distant ones. So there are 3 sets of factors that directly affect household income inequality. One is the volume of work provided by members of the household. Another one is the remuneration of this work and taxes and transfers. And the volume of work, in turn, is influenced by levels of employment in the society. That is, the more the members of a household work and the better their work is paid, the higher is household income, and higher levels of employment in the society mean more households perform more paid work, which should reduce poverty and inequality. Wage dispersion refers to the spread of earnings across the labor force, and the education premium to the average wages of people with secondary or tertiary education completed compared to people who don't have it. Going back one step further in the causal chain, levels of employment in the society, of course, are shaped by economic growth, but also by work-family conciliation policies that make it possible for women to combine paid work and raising children. Wage dispersion and the education premium are influenced by the size of the informal sector, but also by labor market institutions such as union density, labor rights, and minimum wage legislation. And finally, the distribution of educational achievement is very heavily influenced by public investment in health and education. Now, the master variable behind the policies, from work-family conciliation to taxes and transfers, labor market institutions, minimum wage legislation, and so on, and investment in health and education is the balance of political forces between forces committed to lessening inequality and forces indifferent or hostile to state action in this particular endeavor, or what we generally call the left-right balance of political forces. Now, a second variable that may push and support efforts of left governments is the strength of civil society. That is the density, unity, and autonomy of organizations representing subordinate classes. And finally, the key variable allowing the strengthening of civil society and left parties is democracy. So this is essentially the theoretical model in our book. So let me now consider alternative arguments, and this time work forward. In other words, beginning with democracy and the left. I do not think the general argument that democracy results in more redistribution than authoritarianism is controversial. I am not making a general theoretical statement that in all places at all times that is true. I am making the statement that democracy in post-World War II capitalist Latin America has been more redistributive than authoritarian regimes, most of which were right-wing authoritarian regimes. Okay. Obviously, the glaring exception is Cuba. Somewhat more contested is the mechanism that accounts for democracies adopting policies that result in lowering inequality. Our explanation in the book is that it is the chance for organizations representing the interests of the underprivileged to grow and influence policy. This refers specifically to parties of the left, but also to social movements and other civil society organizations. Essentially, we are saying that organization is the key power resource, and there it goes, of underprivileged groups. Part of the evidence is that the effects of democracy on inequality mostly kick in after some 20 years. Okay? It takes time for previously repressed groups and parties to grow, gain strength, win elections, and influence policy. The other part of the evidence is that left governments have presided over more redistributive policies than non-left governments, and thank you, Vincent, for replicating that finding. And that social movements have often served as pressure and support groups for left governments, as among others, Andrea and Nitswicki have shown. Now, the alternative view is that the mechanism that translates democracy into distribution is electoral competition, and specifically electoral competition for the votes of the poor, as Garay argues. The evidence to support this view is that non-left governments also expanded non-contributory cash transfers and health insurance. And the main cases used here are Mexico and Peru. There are 2 points, I think, that are ignored in this argument. First, it was not competition for votes specifically and primarily with another centrist or right-wing party that induced these governments to expand social policy, but rather competition with the left. The Mexican healthcare reform, I think, has to be seen in the context of the repeated candidacies of López Obrador and his healthcare reform in Mexico City, which introduced free healthcare for the poor and additional care and financial support for the elderly poor. In Peru, the left introduced a bill for universal health care in the legislature, which then galvanized APRA to accept a plan that had actually been elaborated by USAID and sell that plan to Alan Garcia. Garcia and Abra had not run on healthcare reform. They had not competed for votes on the basis of promises to expand health insurance. They acted to prevent a more progressive reform from gaining traction. Second, formal coverage greatly expanded in Mexico and Peru, but de facto access remained very limited and highly unequal, and expenditures remained below that in countries with left governments. Here we have total health expenditure of all levels of government, national and subnational. And we can see, again, the general upward trajectory led by Argentina, Uruguay, and Costa Rica. Also very steep increases, again, in Bolivia and Ecuador, and very moderate increase in Mexico, ending up with clearly the lowest expenditure of any of these countries. So then let's turn to left-right differences in policies. Okay? In health and education, left governments have emphasized reforms aimed at improving both the accessibility and quality of services. Public expenditure tells us a lot, but it does by no means tell the whole story. Allocation of expenditure is equally important from a distributive point of view. Left governments expanded primary and preventive care, and they pursued an equalization between public and private providers, successfully so in Uruguay with a single payer plan, less successfully so in Chile, where the equalization fund was defeated in parliament, but guaranteed access to treatment for an ever-expanding set of common illnesses was achieved. Efforts were made to improve primary and secondary education and expand access to tertiary education. Here we have, again, data on total government expenditures on public education. Two things are striking. First, the tremendous efforts made by Costa Rica and Bolivia. And Ecuador, given how low Ecuador started, right? And also strong upward trajectory in Chile. Second, the very low level that Uruguay started from and its catch-up effort. And again, the very moderate growth in Mexico, though the level at the end in Mexico is comparatively not that low. However, in Mexico, as we will see later with enrollment figures, there is a lot of slippage between spending on education and effect. All right, now, as Niedzwiecki and Pribble point out in a recent paper, left governments continued to invest in improvements in social services even after the end of the commodity boom. In other words, they tackled what Holland and Schneider call the more difficult tasks in social policy reform. And let me just mention some of these policy innovations. Bachelet, in her second term, embarked on an extremely ambitious investment program in the health sector, in addition to reforming education. The Frente in Uruguay established a national care system for children and the elderly. Dilma targeted the extremely poor with increased cash benefits and access to services, and Cristina universalized early childhood education, making it mandatory for 4-year-olds. In contrast, the Temer government put a cap on federal public spending that has reduced spending on health, education, and social security. Looking at other policy areas, in the area of labor legislation, again, Uruguay has been very successful with the reintroduction of tripartite bargaining and the growth in union density. Union density has increased in Argentina as well, And Cristina expanded rights, including limited working hours and access to pensions to rural and domestic workers. The minimum wage was raised very significantly in Chile and Brazil. And in Brazil, this meant an increase in non-contributory social benefits because they are tied to the minimum wage. Okay. In our model, we treat the size of the informal sector as essentially an exogenous variable, a function of economic development. And if we look at the graphs, we see that this is essentially correct insofar as the less developed countries have much larger informal sectors. But we also see what's interesting in the more advanced countries is the relative stability in Argentina and the drop in Uruguay, which suggests that to some extent they are susceptible to policy, that is, reaching out and trying to register small enterprises actually can be successful. All right, so in transfers, generally, the left has been more effective in expanding non-contributory transfers and improving the benefits in those programs, even though here the differences are not as pronounced as they are in services, because political claim and credit, political blame and credit are more obvious. So competition for votes here may be a substitute for ideological commitment. Here you can see that as of these data are from 2011. Okay. Mexico is right with Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay in red, covering about a quarter of the population and spending about 0.5% of GDP. Ecuador and Bolivia cover larger sectors of the population, and Ecuador spent significantly more as well. But given the visibility and the popularity of these benefits, none of the right-wing candidates who have won elections campaigned on promises to cut them. On the contrary, they all promised to keep them, and outright cuts actually were extremely rare, particularly where election results were close, such as in Chile and Argentina. More typical has been policy drift. That means non-adjustment of the benefits to rising consumer prices, and that has been the strategy of Macri in Argentina. Brazil is an exception, and I shall get back to it. So, finally, again, going back to the model, in work-family conciliation policies, Blowfield, Ewig, and Piscopo have shown that left governments did make improvements on gender issues, even though they were reactive rather than proactive. In other words, left parties and candidates didn't come to power with a clear gender equity agenda, but they reacted to pressures from feminist networks by putting the issues on the agenda, and to different degrees, they passed legislation that resulted in improvements in the position of women. And Blowfield and Touchton have shown that longer parental leave is indeed associated with higher women's labor force participation, even though they actually argue the reverse causality, that is, women's participation then in various forms results in better leave policies. And so we can certainly accept a positive feedback effect here. At any rate, for a variety of reasons, women's labor force participation has greatly increased in Latin America since 1990, and work-family conciliation policies have certainly helped. So the purple here is the increase in women's labor force participation from 1990 to 2014. Now, when it comes to the impact of all these policies on inequality, Lopez, Galva, and Lustig showed in their 2010 book that the decline in the education premium and increasing transfers to the poor both contributed to the decline in inequality. And in a more recent publication, a 2014 special issue of the Public Finance Review, Lustig, Pesino, and Scott, with data for 2009, show that direct taxes and transfers have what they call a non-trivial inequality reducing impact in Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, more so than in Bolivia, Mexico, and Peru. If the value of health and education spending is factored into the calculation, inequality reduction is even greater, but the differences between the countries persist. So let's now look at what has happened to these drivers of inequality. And this time, let's work forward from democracy to left strength and so on and so forth. So what has been the trajectory of democracy since roughly 2000? This is data from the VDEM, Varieties of Democracy project, and we see on the aggregate an amazing amount of stability. They have 4 different indicators: electoral democracy, liberal democracy, participatory and egalitarian democracy. And as you can see, they all basically move in tandem, and that is true if we look at individual countries. So we can, from now on, we will just look at electoral democracy. Clearly, if we go from the aggregate Latin American average to individual countries, we see a different story. Here we see Costa Rica, Chile, and Uruguay totally stable. Argentina, very slight deterioration. Mexico, significant increase till 2000, and then more or less stability. And El Salvador, a significant increase to the level of Mexico. Very different if we look at these countries. First of all, the drop in Brazil after 2014, then the decline in Ecuador and Bolivia, and the very steep declines in Nicaragua and Venezuela. All right. Whoop. Just a minute. So what then has happened to the strength of left parties? The obvious development is that they have lost the presidency in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and El Salvador, and that they have ceased to be democratic and become highly repressive in Venezuela and Nicaragua. However, it is important to note that in Argentina, the total electoral support for the Peronists in the first round of the presidential elections was 58.5%. And in Chile, the total support for left candidates in the first round was 48.7%. So the point is that it was divisions among the left in Chile and among the Peronists in Argentina that brought about their defeat, not a massive turn to the right. Also, of course, Mexico elected a leftist president. So I agree with Ken and Santiago in their recent Aula piece that we cannot talk about a massive retreat of the left. The key to the defeat of the left in presidential elections were divisions on the left. This was the case in Chile and Argentina, whereas the left remained united in Uruguay, in Ecuador, at least until after the elections, and in Bolivia. Winters and White Shapiro have also shown that in Brazil, small leftist parties were broadly represented among protesters in 2013 already. So then what has happened to the relationship between social movements and left parties in government? Here we see different trajectories. The Concertación in Chile, of course, distanced itself from social movements in the 1990s already and never regained strong ties. Indeed, the social movements of the 2000s challenged Bachelet just as they challenged Piñera. As Luna has argued strongly, the political elites, including of the left in Chile, lost legitimacy, and the parties have become uprooted. A similar trajectory, of course, can be seen in the case of the PT. Decision-making in the party became centralized, and the party bases had little influence on policymaking. So the PT leadership also became increasingly distanced from the social movements out of which it had emerged, and its social mobilization capacity declined. In both Chile and Brazil, protest movements challenged incumbent left governments severely and weakened them rather than serving as assets in getting policies passed. In Bolivia, in contrast, the relationship between the social movements and the mass have remained closer, though the relationship obviously has not been without its conflicts. And finally, the same is true for Uruguay, though ironically, in that country, the close relationship to the teachers' union has obstructed education reform, and the failure in that field may have long-lasting negative impacts on inequality, and I shall come back to this. Okay, but what about the ability of the remaining or possible future left presidents to design and implement coherent policies? And here, I think in our book, we did not really pay sufficient attention to the ability of governments to design and implement effective policies in the key areas that shape inequality. We assumed this ability, and among our focal cases, that is the most likely cases, this assumption seemed appropriate for Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, and Uruguay, with only Brazil being problematic because of the party system and thus the difficulty of finding support for policy initiatives in parliament. And so actually I had no idea what Vincent was going to present. So what I'm going to say now is completely following up on what he already presented. So essentially, there is a party system component to the ability to design and implement effective policies, and the state component. The party system component shapes the capacity to make the rules, and the state component, the capacity to implement them. I don't really think this is controversial. Lots of scholars have emphasized the importance of state capacity, and many others have analyzed the institutionalization of the party system and its consequences. So Ken's work, Gustavo's work, and Vincent's work would certainly provide evidence for the importance of party system changes and party system institutionalization in shaping government policies. Okay, I could digress and talk a little about corruption, but I don't want to take all that much time, so we may have to come back to this later. So, looking at parties and party systems, the ability of left presidents to design and implement coherent reform policies rests on a president's partisan control of the legislature or the president's ability to assemble support coalitions for such reforms. To assemble reliable support coalitions, the effective number of parties should be moderate, and party leaders should be able to deliver support from most of their representatives. The presence of multitudes of parties without party discipline makes governing for left parties without a partisan majority very difficult, and it diminishes not only trust in parties, but trust in government. And that's the story of Brazil. Looking at the data, the only giant outlier in terms of effective number of parties is Brazil. Brazil always had a large number of parties represented in parliament, and that number even increased. So perspectives for effective policymaking are dim indeed. Now, with 4.9 effective parties, surprisingly, Costa Rica has now the third most fractionalized party system in Latin America. In Chile, the center-left coalition that governed for most of the post-1990 period broke apart for good in 2017, paving the way for the right victory. Bolivia and Ecuador, as you can see, have completely new party systems with a dominant left party and a fragmented opposition. But Correa broke with Moreno after the elections, so now the left is divided as well, which does not augur well for the future. And the problem with Bolivia is that Morales is not grooming a successor and is moving toward violating the rules of electoral democracy. The struggle over his continuation in office is likely to take center stage and block progress on other policies. So the main countries where we can still expect actual progress in the short run in redistributive policies are Uruguay and most recently Mexico. Though, as just noted, and I will come back to it, education is a big problem in Uruguay. And we might, despite the effective number of parties, we might add Costa Rica to this list. And again, I'll come back to this. So, if the prospects for further progress with existing programs and major new initiatives look rather dim, what about preservation of the previous gains? And now let's focus on the proximate factors, the education premium. I think the education premium should stay relatively low or decline further where left governments have invested in human capital, which they have done a lot. What this is enrollment figures among the bottom quintile, that is the poorest 20%. This is the share of 7 to 12-year-olds from the poorest 20% attending primary school, essentially. And as we can see, by about 2005, 2010, we have virtually universal primary attendance in Costa Rica, Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay, and Brazil. We see that tremendous improvement in Brazil, and we see Mexico a little behind, but fairly close. If we go to secondary education, again, from the poorest quintile, we also see the tremendous increases in Costa Rica, Brazil, Argentina, Chile. We see Mexico lagging far behind, and look at Uruguay, ending up in the same place as Mexico. If we go to the tertiary level, we see again very strong increases in Argentina, Costa Rica, and Chile. Even a slight decline in Brazil. And I'm very interested to compare with your data showed a kind of constant increase, right? And you had from the poorest quintile as well. So somewhere our data, these are CEPAL data anyway, our data don't square. So maybe Brazil is more optimistic, I don't know. But just look at how low Mexico and Uruguay are. So bottom line, the education premium should continue to go down in Argentina, Chile, and Costa Rica, might stay stable at a lower level in Brazil, but it might not improve much in Mexico and Uruguay. Transfers should be resilient where large sectors of the population are covered. So the solidarity pensions in Chile should be safe, as should be the non-contributory pensions in Bolivia and Ecuador. In terms of the cash transfers to the working age households, again, Bolivia and Ecuador have the largest coverage. And as noted, in general, right-wing successor governments have not cut benefits of cash transfers, well aware of the political costs of doing so. Brazil is the exception here, due to the extreme political weakness of the PT, as shown in the 2016 local elections. Temer's government began, and Bolsonaro is continuing it, a big anti-fraud campaign. And they have excluded close to 6 million people from Bolsa Familia on the grounds of violations of the income limit, along with close to 450,000 recipients of sickness and disability pensions. And still, there have not been any large-scale protests. Okay, so I'd be surprised if it stayed that way. Finally, I have not said much about the international context yet. It is important to emphasize that the decade of the commodity boom has given most of Latin America a degree of economic independence from the United States and the international financial institutions that was unprecedented. As Campello tells us, the combination of high commodity prices and low interest rates in the developed world lessen constraints on left governments to toe the market-friendly, investor-friendly line, and of course the various regional integration efforts further challenged U.S. hegemony. Excuse me. And the end of the Cold War, of course, at least temporarily, opened greater opportunities for left governments in Latin America. So the international system was supportive or at least permissive of redistributive reforms in democratic contexts. I think we are reverting to a much more challenging international environment. Here is the development of the commodity price index. And here are interest rates in the developed world. The former are down and the latter are up. Certainly, the recession in Brazil and the austerity measures adopted to deal with it were the death knell for Dilma. In addition, arguably, the populist wave washing over some of the key OECD countries, and specifically the presence of Trump, has emboldened right-wing populists in Latin America. And of course, Trump has embraced Bolsonaro. Moreover, there are a couple more unknowns. We do not know how China's relationship will evolve. Will they continue to invest, or will they withdraw and collect on the debts incurred by Latin American countries? And if so, will this bring the IMF back onto the scene? All right, so in all this uncertainty, let me end with some general reflections on the experience of left governments. The situation reflects the complexity of redistributive reforms in democratic contexts. Small steps or moderation are crucial to minimize opposition and maintain economic stability. That is what we have learned from the negative experiences of Allende and of Manley in Jamaica. And one might add Chavez in Venezuela to this list. And this, of course, is also what the positive experience of European social democracy teaches us. However, small steps for too long in highly unequal environments may lead to disappointment and defection and challenges from the left, which is what we have been witnessing in Chile and to a lesser extent in Brazil. And I certainly think that the original proponents of the J-curve of relative deprivation had a point. Important improvements can generate expectations for continued improvements. And when a deterioration of conditions occurs, this can lead to frustration and anger. The progress in Brazil was amazing, but when bus prices rose and the economy contracted and poverty and inequality took a turn upwards, fear of losing the recent economic gains and frustration turned to anger at the government, and this anger then, of course, was fueled by the corruption scandals. The relationship to social movements is part of this complexity. Left parties need ties to civil society to win elections and to govern. They need those ties as a counterweight to the power of business. But in highly unequal societies, allied civil society organizations may use their mobilization capacity to push governments into reforms further and faster than the governments consider politically feasible. As Ken told us, this is what the Chilean elites learned or overlearned from the Allende experience. However, on the other side, if there is empty political space, or where popular organizations lack access to representation through left parties, spontaneous protest movements may fill that void and intensify popular frustrations, which is what we saw happening in Chile and Brazil. In terms of the relationship to civil society, Uruguay and Bolivia are in a very strong situation, but in both cases, there is a big problem. In Uruguay, it is the relationship to the teachers' union that is blocking progress in education, which, as we saw, is badly needed. And in Bolivia, the strength of support from civil society has enabled Morales to ignore the need to plan for democratic succession. Now, since I do want to end with a ray of hope, at least, let me point out that it is possible for new challengers from the left to win executive elections, as in Costa Rica, and to pass long-delayed important legislation that will put the admirable Costa Rican social policies on a firmer financial footing. Alvarado, the leader of the Partido Acción Ciudadana, in December succeeded where his two predecessors had failed and managed to pass a badly needed and long-delayed tax reform to reduce the deficit. What is behind this victory, despite the lack of partisan control of the legislature? Certainly well-consolidated democratic institutions. Sometimes responsible politicians indeed do work across the aisles to pass important and badly needed legislation. Moreover, Costa Rican society has long been among the least unequal in Latin America. And we know from post-industrial societies that the societies that have the most equal pre-tax and transfer distribution also redistribute the most. That is, and citizens have more egalitarian attitudes. So there is a benevolent cycle or a positive feedback effect from politics to attitudes and back to policies. The problem is that it literally takes decades for this cycle to become strong. And the decade or decade and a half of successful left rule was not nearly sufficient to get this cycle started in Latin American societies. Moreover, the cycle is not immune from external shocks. in post-industrial societies, it is being endangered by mass immigration. And in Latin America, it is vulnerable to commodity prices and interest rates in core economies. So, no certainties, as we all know, but I think it is safe to say that the decade or decade and a half of successful left rule in the context of favorable economic conditions has established policy legacies that make citizens expect more from their governments in terms of social safety nets. These reforms have drawn more low-income students into education. They have helped more women to combine work and family, and thus help to increase women's labor force participation. And they have increased accessibility and quality of health services, all of which leaves room for at least some optimism regarding at least a preservation of the gains achieved in lowering inequality. And I thank you for your attention.
Any questions from the audience?
Gustavo.
Yeah, thank you so much for this talk, Evelyne. My question has to do with the distinction between, broadly speaking, the responsible left and the more populist left. And if we think of Uruguay, Chile, certainly in the responsible category, and then perhaps Bolivia and Ecuador, more drastic policies and more redistributive. When we look at the outcomes, is it fair to say that both types of left have been fairly successful or equally successful at redistributing during their period, but that the difference has been how sustainable these policies can be in the long run? Or is there a clear difference that, Chile and Uruguay have redistributed just much less than, the Kirchners did and that Morales has and Correa did. I don't know if my point has come across correctly, but
sure.
Just sort of is there had been this fear that there would be just very different trajectories in terms of the outcome of redistribution. And the main concern seemed to be just how unsustainable the radical left would be at doing so. Is that a fair characterization?
Not entirely. So, certainly, I think Uruguay and Chile are the most sustainable, right? And certainly in Uruguay, as the deepest kind of transformation of the healthcare system. And very importantly, changing power relations in society with the reintroduction of tripartite commissions and so on and so forth. Chile also very sustainable, very conservative macroeconomic policy and so on. But Bolivia could really be sustainable, right? Obviously, a lot depends on commodity prices, natural gas, but so it does for Chile on copper, right? So very clearly the kind of Venezuela for a long time was a disaster in the making because he never invested in infrastructure. And a lot of expenditure was just really non-accounted for, right? Just went into those misiones, and so that is clearly an example of an irresponsible left, unaccountable. Korea is complicated. Korea did a lot in investing in infrastructure, right? He modernized that country in addition to doing very important redistributive work. What is coming out now is how much he mortgaged oil exports to China. So future, at least in the past in the next 5 or 10 years, Ecuadorian governments will have a really hard time finding the resources to maintain. So anyway, what I'm saying is it's, yes, kind of unbalanced, but not so clear-cut, right? And it's kind of the classification of Morales as a populist left or whatever is a little uncomfortable anyway, right? Yes, so we have this, he came out of a decayed party system, that is correct, but he also came out of strong social movements. So it's not an empty organizational space where he could do whatever he wanted. Sid.
You said you would say a little bit more about corruption, and you didn't keep your promise. Can I ask you to do that? And can you also say just how much you think the collapse of Venezuela and the probable collapse of Nicaragua has to do with corruption?
Okay, so let me first say what I was going to say. We did not pay in our book. You can hardly find the word corruption. Okay, I don't know whether it's even in the index. And so, and the reason why is that, well, first of all, our cases, right, are the most advanced, Argentina and so on. And we figured they all had the state capacity. And what most of political science has been worried about in Latin America is clientelism, is corruption low down, right?
Passing it to you, Evelyne. Entry for corruption in Brazil, page 205.
Okay, one. Okay, I mean, in our defense, this was published in 2012. Okay, so right. All right. So and the example was, so yeah, everybody was worried about clientelism and so on and so forth, using the use of public policy for political purposes. And lo and behold, here comes Bolsa Familia in a country known for its clientelism. So, and by all accounts, right, people did very serious work on it and said it is free of clientelism. So we just went, okay, if governments want to do it, they can do it. So we assume they can do it. In terms of top-level corruption, of course, one is aware of top-level corruption. But we kind of thought, well, some top-level corruption is compatible with effective government. Look at South Korea, right? They have, in the crisis, people talked about crony capitalism and so on and so forth. They recovered. They are a very effective government, industrial upgrading, breakthrough to technology, the knowledge society, and so on and so forth, and building up a welfare state. So that's why we, at the time, didn't worry very much about it. But now more to your question. Well, certainly the corruption is very important in those cases of collapse, but there is more to it than that, because Brazil, we just have the biggest corruption scandals you can imagine, and Brazil has not collapsed. So it's not a sufficient condition for collapse, but it can certainly be a contributing condition for collapse.
I really appreciate the charts you showed with separating for the lowest quintile or decile, I forget, for educational, for the share of the population that was enrolled in for that particular level of education. And you had mentioned that in Uruguay, the teachers' unions had been fairly, I posed this obstacle. And it really caught my eye that Mexico, I wasn't expecting Mexico to be just so wildly off compared to pretty much all the other countries. But it's interesting that in the current leftist government, the current government is sort of dismantling the reform that the previous administration had adopted to try to introduce merit-based evaluations and these kinds of things. So, both Mexico and Uruguay now seem to be having, I don't know if this responds to the teachers' union or what is behind this, but it's very clear that the leftist administration, AMLO's administration in Mexico, is just dismantling whatever reforms had moved in the direction of introducing performance measures to improve the educational system. So, it's another instance in which the left, I don't know if it's because of electoral commitments, but it's sort of clearly undermining the future of the country in terms of human capital.
That is interesting to me because, of course, the teachers' union in Mexico was not a big base for López Obrador, no? I mean, they are close to the PRI, have been historically.
Have been historically. Yeah, I think there's quite a bit of a split, and some factions have become more aligned with the pragmatic, before the election, just the sense that clearly he was going to win, and they abandoned ship and just switched to, just to be part of the winning.
Okay, but so he doesn't owe them as much. See, in Uruguay, they are a very integral part of the Frente, right? And so they are crucial to the Frente's winning elections and so on. So they have not been able to shake him. So, but yeah, I mean that's the flip side, right, of the complicated relationship to civil society organizations. They can push too far, but they can also resist. And if they are not there, then somebody else can fill the void. So that's. Ken.
If there isn't anybody else, can I ask another question?
Go ahead.
So this is not quite on your topic, but you did mention social movements. And I wondered, as a Europeanist, I wondered whether you think the phenomenon of movement parties is finished in Latin America. In Western Europe, Central Europe, we saw a wave of movement parties in response to austerity. And we thought that the wave was over when the economic crisis was over. Well, it wasn't over. The movement parties continue to be generated and continue to extrude traditional parties. So what about the wave of movement parties in Latin America that we were all excited about 10 years ago? Has that phenomenon ended, or is the party system that was reconstructed in the last decade beginning to collapse again, as the European one is? Maybe this is a question for John.
No, this is a question for Ken. He is the expert on party systems. Well, first of all, what the Levitsky book tells us is that very few of those parties have really managed to institutionalize themselves. I'm trying to think over the past, let's say, past 5 years, whether we have seen more new parties emerging. That would be movement parties, right? Of course, you see all kinds of parties popping up, but movement parties, and I'm at a loss.
I think it's in gestation in Chile, and so the place where you get new social movements that have outflanked the moderate left in power under what was the Concertación, but coming out of the student movement, there has been a new. In fact, I believe they call it the Frente Amplio. I have to tracking Chile as closely as I should be, but there is a new movement-based more radical left, outflanking with the Socialist Party and the PPD, which was sort of the center left that was very much part of the government for quite some time. And so that's the place where, I mean, in a sense, I mean, I even, somewhere I wrote a piece where I talked about a third wave of anti-neoliberal protest in Latin America that Chile was on the cusp of, because they went through all of these cycles a little bit earlier. And I argued that that there was a new movement-based left coming out of that experience. And there was a moment in Brazil in 2013 where you got the sense maybe when that protest movement began, and there was a critique of the PT from the left that was part of that initial cycle in 2013. But then I would argue that cycle gravitated in a much more conservative direction and became a very much an anti-PT movement from the right. And I would argue, I don't think that's necessarily become a new movement party of the right under Bolsonaro. I think it's a different dynamic. But I think I would say that Chile is the only place where I would see a new, more radical movement-based party on the left emerging. And, you know, Bolivia, certainly you've got a movement-based party in the MAS. But actually, it's not clear to me that either Venezuela or Ecuador really created a movement-based party as opposed to a leadership-based dynamic, which I think is rather different. And so, you know, even though we talk about movement parties in Latin America, the PT was a movement party. The MAS has been a movement party, and I think Chile has recently created one, but it's still less common than what I think we often perceive it. That's my take.
I would completely agree with that. Yeah.
We might have time for one more question, or unless people are anxious to get to the reception. Anything else?
It depends. Is there alcohol?
To the right is alcohol, to the left is for those who are under 21.
Wow.
Can I ask one final question, Evelyne? I mean, it's sort of Gustavo's question gets at this sort of these debates we had 10 or 15 years ago about good lefts, bad lefts, populists, social democrats, all of this stuff. And you know, when I sort of look at the natural categories that people formed out of those debates, and you know, if you take sort of the classic cases, Brazil, Uruguay, Chile is sort of a social democratic left, and Brazil or Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador is this Bolivarian left. You can look at both of those categories and you find basket cases or, you know, disasters on both sides. But the PT in Brazil at this point, and Venezuela on, you know, from the Bolivarian left. And you can look at both camps and you find cases that, you know, are where the left is still governing, is relatively stable, and the economy is stable. So Uruguay or Bolivia, which is actually the most radically redistributive of all the cases in the region, and is also one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing economy in Latin America over the last 10 years, certainly among the most. And so it's, you know, it doesn't appear to me that those categories alone tell us much about the experience of the left turn. And you know, my sense is that, you know, among the moderate social democratic left, there were cases where they started out talking about transforming the system, but at the end of the day, the system transformed the left, and they became so much a part of the system that, you know, in Chile or in Brazil, that they, you know, they were then at some point outflanked by more radical alternatives. And I think for you know, you look at Venezuela or Nicaragua, I think the lesson of the costs of sort of assuming that there's some sort of hegemonic project on the left that doesn't have to share power, that doesn't have to find some mechanisms for, you know, for alternation, as you were talking about. So I think you can identify lessons and failures on both cases, and I'm just curious as to what are the positive lessons. My sense is that Uruguay and Bolivia, what stands out for me on those two cases, from the two different categories, those were the two lefts where I would argue that the party stayed most closely related to the social basis and the social movements themselves, and that there were certain mechanisms of accountability in both Uruguay and Bolivia that prevented these catastrophic detours that you see in some of the other places. And I'm curious as to your sense of that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. In other words, those right? I mean, in Chile, the real problem for the left has been the disappointment, the distancing, they have done good work. Bachelet did really good work. The solidarity pensions are important. The Auge, the healthcare system reform, is very important. And they had much better plans, but they couldn't get it through, right? And so they continued to work on it. So anyway, the tragedy there was really the disappointment with the slow progress that was being made. Now I lost my train of thought. The question was, the good cases and the bad cases.
Yeah.
No, the successful cases or. Right. The mechanisms of accountability and yeah. And I think it's also a matter of communication. And there is another thing that really struck me. And what struck me is the following, and I actually have some additional data. I think the first steps in significant reform have a much bigger political impact than later steps. So Bolivia and Ecuador had the advantage that they built from nothing in terms of social policy, right? In Chile, there had been social policy, so there was kind of an expectation. And they rebuilt super gradually, super slowly, right? So the first 10 years, of course, under the Concertación, that wasn't even the left. In other words, it was a center-left coalition led by the center, by centrist presidents. So very little was happening. Whereas, anyway, since you asked, let me. So this is trust in government, but here, this is what I thought was a super fascinating set of data. So this is, the question is, do you agree that this, or disagree, agree or disagree that this country is governed for the benefit of the powerful, or this country is governed for the benefit of all, for the good of all, okay? So first, you see the radical decline between 2010 and 2017 I'm sorry, not decline, the radical increase in Brazil, right? From 2010, 48% say, or only 48% say it's governed for the benefit of the powerful. By 2017, that has more than doubled. Very interesting is how that falls in Nicaragua, how it falls in Bolivia. And my interpretation of this is, and that's the kind of reflected here in trust in government. Trust in government in Bolivia and Ecuador by 2017 is as high as Uruguay. And what I'm saying, what this is about, look at how much lower it is in Chile, and not to speak of Brazil. This is kind of in those, and Nicaragua, of course, this is before the confrontations started. So what I'm saying is those are governments that for the first time did something real for their populations, right? Whereas in Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, the expectations are a lot higher, and then the disappointment is much steeper. So,
well, Evelyne, we thank you very much for sharing.